Hello and welcome to our National Education Nature Park webinar, Monitoring Wildlife on Your Site. Joining us is myself, Dr. Victoria Burton. I'm a postdoctoral researcher on the Nature Park, and my colleague, Dr. Jade Gunnell. Next slide, please. We're both researchers at the Natural History Museum, and this week it is Insect Week. So we're celebrating all things insects. Insect Week is run by the Royal Entomological Society. They're a leading society in the UK and internationally to promote all things insect science. And there are actually more insects than any other group of animal, and over 24,000 in the UK alone. But I think it's fair to say that maybe they don't get as much love as other groups of animal. Despite the fact they do lots of important roles for us, such as decomposition, turning all the dead leaves and animals and dung back into nutrients that plants can use, and pest control, so eating a lot of the caterpillars and aphids and other things that would otherwise eat our crops, and reducing the need for us to use pesticides, and pollination, in making a lot of the fruits and vegetables that we need. So this week we're celebrating insects, and today we're bringing you our new, next slide please, pollinator count. So what is the pollinator count? Well, it's the first survey we're launching for the Nature Park to find out what wildlife is in your sites. And we'd like you to first map your habitats, but then the survey involves finding some flowers in your habitats and placing a 50 centimetre by 50 centimetre square or quadrat over the flowers, and choosing one particular flower that's growing within the quadrat, and then for a set amount of time counting the insects that land on the flower. And we don't need you to identify to species the different insects. Even experts have trouble doing that. We just like you to count them into different groups, and we'll go through this in more detail later on in the webinar. And then we'd like you to record some weather conditions along with standard things like the date and the time you did the survey. And on to the next slide. But why would we like you to monitor wildlife in the nature park? Well, there's two steps in the nature park cycle, 5-step cycle, that the pollinator count fits into. The first one is step one, getting to know the space. So it's really important to know what wildlife is already on your site before you make changes. You don't want to damage existing habitats that are being used on your site. And it also can give you an idea where to make improvements. So having a good look at your site, seeing where you're getting a lot of different pollinators or other wildlife and where you're not, helping you decide where to make improvements for wildlife. And as the cycle goes on, you also want to monitor wildlife to record those changes. So there's an idea of where we're making a difference. You need something to measure against. And together, we also can find out the best ways of boosting nature. By measuring it, we can find out which changes work and which are not so good, and also how this can change across the country, which different methods work best in which settings. And next slide, please. Oh, back one slide, please. But why monitor insects in particular? Well, one of the advantages of insects is they are everywhere, so they're relatively easy to find and survey. We can find them all over England, in schools and colleges, nurseries, from tiny ones to big ones. We don't have to worry too much about whether you have to go out and survey and whether you're going to be able to find them or not. They're there mostly everywhere. And they're also relatively sensitive to change. So you can measure any differences in the numbers and types of insects on a fairly short time scale, from over a period of years rather than having to wait perhaps decades if you were measuring changes in sort of larger animals or large plants, for example. And another useful thing about insects is they have important roles, as I said earlier, for example, pollination. So that makes them really good indicators of the health of the site. And another important point is that the more you monitor, the more you can find out. So measuring just the once is only a little snapshot of how well your site's doing. But by measuring different areas of your site, you can get a better overview, but even more importantly, measuring several times gives you an idea of how it's changing over time, and measuring in where you've made changes to your site and where you haven't can give you a good comparison of how those changes are making a difference. So we move on to the next slide. Why have we chosen to monitor pollinators in particular? Well, there are at least 1,500 pollinator species in the UK, but actually only a small number of these have been studied in detail. But worryingly, of those we have studied, 2/3 of them are in decline. And this is concerning because 80% of the wild plants in the UK depend on insects for pollination. So without them, wild plants would really struggle. They wouldn't be setting seed, they wouldn't be able to reproduce, and they would also show declines. And if you're looking at it from a purely human point of view, this is really worrying for us too, because although we wouldn't starve, most of our kind of staples, such as cereals, are wind pollinated. They do pollinate many of our fruit and vegetable crops, which are worth a lot of money, but also they're kind of important for a diet. It'd be pretty boring if we didn't have fruit and vegetables, and they're also nutritionally important. So it's really important that we monitor pollinators and see how they're doing. And for me as an entomologist, the next slide. I just really like studying them because as insects in general, they're amazing. There's lots of different stories we can find out about them. For example, the large one on the middle of the screen, the hornet hoverfly. You might think it looks like a hornet, but it's not. It's pretending to be a hornet. It's an example of convergent evolution. It uses that to avoid being eaten, but it also uses that to sneak into wasp nests where it lays its eggs, where its larvae feed on the stores there. And so they've got lots of wonderful natural history. And because they're found everywhere, you don't have to go out and go to exotic places or have specialist equipment to find them. They're a really good way of learning about science, nature, right on your doorstep. Now I'm going to hand over to Jade, who will go over to the Pollinator Count survey in a bit more detail.
Thank you, Victoria. So before I start talking through how to do the pollinator count in detail, step by step, the first thing I want to really impress upon you is something about the data quality when your students participate in the pollinator count. So outside, within our community science team across the museum, so not just in the Nature Park, we've observed that educators often worry about the quality of the data that their students are collecting, and as a result often don't send the data back to us into our research programs. And so I'd really like to impress upon you today, please do share the data that your students collect, regardless of your students' abilities. We've designed this pollinator count survey to maximise the data quality, taking into account the very diverse experience that we're expecting the students that you're working with to have. And we've also built in checks and balances so that we can verify the data that they're collecting to ensure that it's good quality and can be used for scientific research. So please do send it in, even if you're a bit concerned some of the identifications might be off. Next slide, please. So starting with a little bit of resource and logistics, there are two different ways that you can take part in the pollinator count. The simplest way is to use a mobile device if you have access to them, and to access the survey through the Nature Park website, and the students can then answer the questions on the tablet one at a time. If you don't have access to mobile devices or enough mobile devices, we've provided a printed version of the survey form, which is exactly the same, just a printable version. And I'll call this throughout the webinar the unplugged version. And for this, in this circumstance, your students will also need cameras because they'll need to take some pictures during the survey. Other than clipboards and pencils and more technical, in inverted commas, more technical equipment that you'll need is the quadrats, as mentioned by Victoria, and you can make these yourself out of a piece of string that you peg down in 4 corners to make a square, or get some bamboo canes and tie them at the corners to make a square. And these need to be 50 centimetres by 50 centimetres on each side. And your students will also need some timers to time how long they're observing the insects. You'll need to organise your students into maximum groups of 3, and if you're doing the unplugged version, each group will need their own number so you can keep track of their data and make sure it all comes together at the end. Next slide, please. So when and where to do the survey. So the pollinator count can be done through the spring or summer term or the very early part of the autumn term. So anywhere between the 1st of April and the 30th of September. And you can do it as many times as you like during this period. The more times, the better. You want to pick weather conditions that aren't cold, aren't wet, and are not too windy. So what we recommend is, depending on the flexibility of your schedules, if you're able to schedule 2 sessions, so that if the first session the weather conditions aren't really quite right, you could maybe do insect identification practice in the classroom or some other type of nature park or curriculum activity. And then hopefully the second session will be good weather. If you get to the second session and it's still not ideal, go out and give it a go anyway, because the data that the students collect in the survey will give us an idea of the impact that the weather might be having on the insects that are around on the day. You can carry out the survey in absolutely any of the habitat types you've mapped on your setting, but there needs to be flowers present because we're observing the insects that visit the flowers. So any types of flower in any types of habitat on your site. Next slide, please. Once you've decided which habitats the students are going to be surveying in, if they're using the digital version of the survey on a tablet, this map on the right hand side shows you what they'll see on the survey form, and they'll need to physically locate to the school that you're at and then pinpoint their location and your school grounds as close as they can to where they are. For the unplugged version, you'll need to print a copy of your habitat map, and you'll be able to do this from the Making Change tool that we're launching in a couple of weeks' time. And then you'll need to mark each of your group's location on that map with their group number. And just a note that the students need to know which of the habitats they're actually doing their survey in, because this is one of the first questions they'll be asked in the survey form. Next slide, please. Once they're in position in the habitat that they're going to do the survey in, they then need to go and find a patch of flowers, and they'll place their 50 centimetre by 50 centimetre quadrat over these flowers. This can be on the ground, so on the grass or the lawn, or even on an area of kind of rubble or tarmac where plants might be popping up. But it can also be on a vertical surface, so a hedgerow that might have flowers, or any climbing plants that you might have on site, maybe even a green wall that's flowering. In that quadrat, let's say there's 3 different types of flower. It could be a daisy, a buttercup, and some clover. The students will pick one of those types of flower to observe. So for the purposes of today, let's say clover. But they can pick any type of flower. So it could be wild, something that's got there on its own right, or it could be something that's been cultivated. So something that's been purposefully planted on the school grounds, such as flower pots or vegetable gardens. They'll then need to take 3 photos. So first, a photo like this one on the right hand side, which includes the whole of the quadrat and a little bit of the space around the outside. The second photo is a close-up photo of one of the flowers. And the third photo is a close-up photo of the leaves of that flower. And it's quite all right for them to have their hand in the picture so that they can orientate the flower or the leaf to get a nice focused photograph. Next slide, please. So then you'll also need to record the date, time, and how much time they're going to spend observing insects. Just a note for those of you that will be doing the printed version of the survey and submitting the data later. When you submit the data, we'll want to know the date and the time the survey was conducted, not the date and time that you're submitting the records to us. And then for duration, I'm going to explain this in a bit more detail in a moment, but they have a question where they have to, in the survey form, where they need to say, are they going to watch insects for 10 minutes or 5 minutes? Next slide, please. So once they've got this kind of ground setting, they've got the location, they've got the photographs, they've said what time and day it is, then they'll get straight stuck into recording insects. And they're going to be recording how many of 10 different groups of insects actually land on their chosen flower. So if a bumblebee flies through the quadrat, they can't count it. The bumblebee has to have landed on the clover for it to count. And they'll set a timer for either 10 or 5 minutes, and this is completely at your discretion. The students are going to need to sit around the quadrat as still as possible, as quietly as possible. They're going to need to be on one side of the quadrat and on the side where they're not casting a shadow. And the reason for these little stipulations is we want to minimise how much the human presence is going to disturb the pollinators and the insects moving through the site and visiting the flowers in front of them. So it's up to you to decide whether you think they can manage doing this for the 10 minutes, or if you think that might be a challenge, you can pick the 5-minute option. The difference between the two options in terms of the data is in both circumstances, for 10 and 5 minutes, the data you can use to explore and understand your site better, and our team will use for the scientific research of the Nature Park. But with the 10-minute option, we'll also be sending this data to the National Pollinator Monitoring Scheme, their adult version of this survey, which is the Fit Count survey, and so it will contribute to a larger data set that supports even more research, but also policy making around biodiversity and insects. Next slide, please. So these are the 10 groups that they'll be looking for, and we've provided a printable identification guide to help them work out the differences between some of these groups. So we've got bumblebees, honeybees and solitary bees. We've got wasps and hoverflies. And then any fly that isn't a hoverfly can go in the other fly category. We've got butterflies and moths, we've got beetles, and then we've got 2 groups that kind of clump lots of things together. So the small insects group is for anything that is less than 3 millimeters long. So even if you're someone that knows insects a bit and you recognise tiny little insects on a daisy as pollen beetles, we don't want them in the beetle category. We'd like them in the small insect category because they're so tiny. And then for anything that doesn't fit into those 9 groups, or anything that the students couldn't tell what it was, either it moved too fast, they couldn't get the angle right to see it, or they just weren't confident in where to put it, they can put all of those things into the other insects category. And just to reinforce here that that category is as important to us as the other categories, because one of the things we want to know is the quantity of insects that are visiting the flowers, even if we don't know exactly which type of insect it is. Next slide, please. So that's the main kind of data collection juicy bit, of watching the insects actually visit flowers. But then just to finish off, we'll ask the students to provide us with some contextual information that helps us understand more about the environmental conditions and the ecological conditions on the day, so that we can understand what other factors might be influencing how many insects are coming to visit the flowers and why. So we've got 4 questions about weather, and they're all supported by images that will help the students quickly choose what's the right answer for them, but also support learners at the early ages of Key Stage 2 whose language skills may not be as advanced as older kids. And so the first question is there any shade covering the quadrat? And they can pick between no shade at all, half covered in shade, or completely covered in shade. They then need to decide how cloudy it is today, so either absolutely no clouds, a mixture of clouds and blue sky, or completely cloudy sky. We've then got windy, so the options are the leaves on the trees aren't moving at all, the leaves are moving gently, or the leaves are moving vigorously all the time. And then finally, what is the temperature? With the temperature question, if you've got access to the internet whilst you're out in the school grounds, you can look that up on a device, and the digital tool, the digital survey, actually provides a link out to the Met Office website so that they can search their location and look it up then. But if this isn't going to be technically possible, you can look the temperature up before you go out into the school grounds and share that information with the students at the appropriate time. And I'll just say for each of the pictures provided here, there are text descriptions of what they represent in the survey forms as well. Next slide, please. The last set of data that's core to the survey is about the flowers. And the first one is we want the students, if they can, to tell us what type of flower they've been observing. So we know that they'll know certain things like buttercups and daisies and dandelions. So if they can write that down, that's great. And if you've got the capacity to, get them to look at the scientific name and provide that for us. There's also options. You can use tools like Seek or iNaturalist or the RHS's Plant Finder tool, where you can submit a photo to those apps and they will automatically provide you with an identification. But you could also get some printed guides or identification keys and get them to look through books to work it out for themselves if you wanted. But we understand that botanical identification can be quite scary for a lot of people. So this question about the name is completely optional. This is there if you want to challenge your students and push them a little bit further with the survey. The next question is how much space the chosen flower covers. So for us, it would have been the clover, and the options are less than half the quadrat, half of the quadrat, or more than half of the quadrat. And then we'd like them to count how many of the chosen flower there are in the quadrat. And the diagram here just represents what we mean when how we would define one flower. So the lavender, the purple one, second from the right-hand side, that's got about 12 or 15 tiny little flowers on that flower spike, but we don't want the students to count each individual tiny little flower, and they would consider one flower spike to be one flower head and count that as one. Same with the umbellifer on the very right hand side, this kind of upside down umbrella shape. Each of those clumps is a cluster of teeny tiny little flowers, and we don't want them to, and we're not asking them to count each individual tiny speck. That whole umbellifer would be classed as one flower head for them to count. And then finally, we want them to look at, are there any other flowers growing around the outside of the quadrat? So they will stand around their quadrat, take one large step away from their quadrat, so they're in a big circle around it, and then look between their feet and the edge of the quadrat to see, are there any other flowers present? And the options are, firstly, no, there are no other flowers present. Secondly, yes, but it's only our chosen flower. So in our case, that's the clover. Or thirdly, yes, there are other flowers present, but it's more than one type of flower. Next slide, please. And then finally, we've got an extension activity, and this is completely optional. It's not necessary for us. All the bits before, we need to have a full data set, but this is something that if you've got the time to do, will really help us support the scientific research, because it will help us understand how accurate the students were at their identifications of the insects. So if they're participating on the digital form, they will go around looking for insects similar to the ones that they saw, and they will take a picture, and for each picture they take, they'll be asked to say which insect group it belongs to. And it's completely up to you how much time they spend doing this, so it's whatever time you have available. And then for the unplugged version, they're presented on the survey form with 6 different photos of insects, and they can identify what they think they are. And just to finally say that to treat this like an end of term assessment, we want to understand what the students think these things are, rather than being supported by adults telling them and helping guide them. We'd like the students to do this piece independently. Next slide, please. And finally, submitting the data. So this is where the digital version of the survey is much more efficient. So once you've finished, there's a submit button and the data goes straight to our Nature Park database. But for the unplugged version, you'll need to go to a computer, later that day or straight after the session or the next day. Upload your survey photos from the camera and label them with the correct group number, and then through the Nature Park dashboard, find the pollinator count survey, launch the activity and type in the answers for each of the surveys with their relevant photos. And I'll pass back to Victoria.
So after you've sent your data in, they go to me and the other Nature Park researchers to analyse. And we have various data quality checks in process, checking things like if it's in the right place and the dates are correct, and if they've been identified correctly. So we have all your photographs to check that. And then I'll be doing lots of work mapping and visualising the data and doing some statistical analysis to answer various questions. And later in the next school year, there'll also be tools available for you to access and explore the data. So on to the next slide. And so what questions will you be able to answer using the data? Well, it will let you see which parts of your site have the most flowers and pollinators, and hopefully this will help you understand which areas you'll be able to improve to encourage more. But there'll be other little questions you'll be able to answer using the data, so such which flowers attract more pollinators than others. And you might even be interested in doing mini projects on your site, saying are there effects of temperature and shade and even flower colour on the number and types of pollinators you find. And collectively, the nature data as a whole, next slide, I'll be able to answer many more questions, such as how are pollinators doing across the whole of the nature park, and which kinds of settings have the most insects. Are there more in urban areas or rural areas, for example? And does this vary across the country? Are there more in the north or the south? How does it vary? How does it vary across the year? And eventually, as we collect multiple years, is there changes? And I'll also be able to find out which plants and habitats and different changes people making are best to increase pollinators and be able to feed that back across the schools. Yes, there's going to be hopefully a lovely big data set for me to analyse. So I'm looking forward to receiving your data. And on to the next slide. Yes, and finally, how this links to national pollinator research. So as Jade mentioned, those who do the 10-minute count, it will be able to be fed into the national pollinator monitoring scheme. So the pollinator count is based on the same methodology they use, and this actually is used to inform policymakers on how UK pollinators are doing. So I have a wider research and even inform UK governments. And next slide. And yes, so thank you all for coming on to this webinar. I hope that's been interesting to find out more about pollinators and our first wildlife survey, and I'll be looking forward to seeing your data. Do take part. If you have any questions, you can email into our usual Nature Park email. We will be posting this webinar on our YouTube channel. Thank you all for joining.